Hello and welcome to Let's Talk About It. This is your host, Taylor, and I hope that you are taking care of yourselves. I hope you are feeling excited coming into today's episode because I'm very excited about my guest. And before we get into stuff today, I am currently recording this introduction on Indigenous Peoples Day. And so I do want to take a few minutes to just kind of process through some of my own thoughts around this and, have a little solo conversation by myself that hopefully you benefit from. Gotta love podcasting. So before we start talking about, I'm going to have Dr. Ricky Siegel on the podcast in this episode, who is co-founder and co-director of Modern Sex Therapy Institutes, where I'm getting my PhD in clinical sexology from. But today, as I'm recording this, it's Indigenous Peoples Day. Originally was a national holiday for Columbus Day. And I can't tell if it's just that I'm burnt out, that I'm jaded, but I'm just feeling like very pessimistic about celebrating. And I know in a lot of ways it maybe isn't necessarily my day to celebrate. I'm not sure that it's a day. I think the purpose, right, is like to remember, is at least what I hear from white people, is what I hear from politicians. And I do think, obviously, in any of these conversations, we need to center and we need to listen to Indigenous people and actually do the things that they're saying. And I know that there was some push for, Indigenous Peoples Day to be a holiday, which it's been, and that's great. And I also know that that's not it. This can't be it. And the way that it's a holiday, I don't know if that truly actually honors what is needed or that people take it seriously. I think a lot of people take it as, maybe they get the day off, maybe they get to go have a vacation. It's not, you get what I'm saying? Okay. It doesn't seem like it's actually used to benefit. It kind of feels a little bit like a distraction in some ways of like, okay, we're going to have this day, that is for celebrating, honoring, remembering the struggles of Indigenous peoples. And, we're still going to have Thanksgiving. And it still is listed as Columbus Day, at least in my iCalendar. I can't delete it. It still says Columbus Day. It says in some states or something that it isn't recognized. And in Washington State, it is not, which I'm like very happy about. But sometimes it just feels like it's a distraction, to not having as much fire for those other things like land back, right? The things that really actually create significant change and like, what's the word? Like... I can't think of the word. Amends is the word. Things that actually create significant change and make amends in some way, those things aren't necessarily happening. I don't know that like having a holiday of Indigenous Peoples Day does that. And at the same time, I know just even having Indigenous in our national calendar is a huge part of representation and acknowledgement, which is also necessary. So, I think I find myself kind of balancing the in-between here again of like, okay, I can acknowledge it as something, but it's not everything. It's not the end of things. Just because this is there doesn't mean, that we just say, oh, okay, amends are made, change is made, all that's in the past. Because Indigenous people are still here. And, I really hope that you do spend the day listening to Indigenous folks, educating yourself a little bit more, donating, paying money, paying rent in Seattle here with the Duwamish community. We have real rent that we pay. Some people choose to. I hope that you don't take the day for granted. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to like suffer in that or feel all this shame or feel all this guilt. Like, there is so much beauty within the Indigenous culture. A book I will very gladly, happily recommend is Braiding Sweetgrass. That book is so freaking phenomenal. So phenomenal. There's so many indigenous creators on Instagram that I encourage you to check out, that I encourage you to, engage with, follow their work, support them however you can. I don't know. I'm part jaded and burnt out, and part hopeful and still passionate. And yeah, I wish we would have had a Indigenous person on to kind of talk a little bit more about this day. And unfortunately we don't. It is just me. But I hope you feel seen in some way. I hope I've made sense here. I hope you can take something away from this that is helpful. And now we can talk a little bit about what this episode is going to be. And the interview that you're going to hear is with Dr. Ricky Siegel, who, like I said, is co-founder and co-director of Modern Sex Therapy Institutes. He helps basically train sex therapists, and he also trains sex medicine specialists, which I think is like very unique. But he does this at multiple sites throughout the country and also online. He's located in Florida and is a licensed mental health counselor and board-certified sex therapist, and is certified by ASECT as well as a sex therapist and supervisor. He's been in the field for almost 30 years, working in sexuality education and addiction treatment. He teaches on college campuses and also has a private sex therapy practice. He really has done so many things within this field. So he's a hoot. Okay. I'm letting you know, Ricky's a hoot, and really appreciate him taking the time to come on and chat with us and share a bit of his experience. I'll also say, before we get completely into the episode, to check out the links in the episode notes. If you are interested in attending any courses or getting into one of the sex therapy or sex educator or sex certification programs at Modern Sex Therapy Institutes, you can check out the link in there. I have an affiliate link on there now. So if you're interested in doing sex coaching, being a sex educator, being a sex therapist, I highly recommend you go to that link and check it out, and you can get some more information on the programs. You can even sign up if you want to. But with all of that said, we can now get into our interview with Ricky. So let's talk about it. All right. So welcome to the show, Dr. Ricky Siegel. Thank you for being here.
I am really, really happy to be here with you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah. This is really overdue because you are one of the directors in my program at Modern Sex Therapy Institutes, and you've taught, and, I see you on the screen, and I've talked with Rachel and Joe, and they've both been on here as guests, and this is so overdue. So I'm so happy to have you here finally.
No, and me too. I've been waiting my turn to get to meet you and spend some time with you. Really, yeah, it is overdue, and I'm delighted.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit, just kind of how you got into this field in the first place, and how, you got to being one of the directors of the program. You've been in the sex field for some time.
Yes, it blows my mind. And every day I feel either like I'm dreaming and it's like I can't believe it's happening, or like I got some gig that I can't believe I'm getting away with for this long. Like I'm waiting for someone to say, hey, the jig is up. Mm-hmm. That's actually coming up on 30 years, and I can honestly say it was a series of happy accidents my entire career. I never planned any of it. There was never a day that I said, I want to be a sex therapist. I was a high school kid that was probably too smart for my own good and a little too much of a stoner, and thought that pharmacy school would be a good idea, which for all the wrong reasons. So my ending up in Florida was really just a kind of, mulligan. And then when I made that big shift to leave some demons up north, My brother happened to have been working as first male sexuality educator for Planned Parenthood in Florida on some, at that time in the late 80s, a new male responsibility grant for teen pregnancy prevention. And I came down to pretty much crash on his couch for 3 months in 1989 and haven't left yet.
Yeah.
Found reason to, but ended up kind of parlaying my pharmacy school know-how into working in the drug and alcohol treatment industry. But it was right at that cusp when, mom and pop AA steeped kind of old school treatment centers, the old 28-day model, started to turn into the little mini psych hospitals that they are now. So it's a rant for another time. But my career there, I got the craps of it quick. But it was when my brother was doing sex ed and I was working in addictions, and we realized that those lines that's what ended up being my doctoral dissertation. Right? When I got my clinical sexology PhD, it was on sexuality issues in addiction treatment and recovery, because that entire industry wasn't touching it. Yeah. And my brother and I we found out later, my brother and I in Florida, and folks like Doug Ron Harvey in San Diego, and just a couple of other people scattered around the country, Lisa Schultz in Nebraska, of all places, right? Few people were doing this. We're going into treatment centers talking about sex. And so it was kind of crazy. But as I said, I didn't want anything to do with people coming to get off drugs. And the first thing I did was put them on drugs. And right, I left. I mean, I really left. I took a little inheritance money I had and opened a coffee shop in Delray Beach before there were coffee houses outside of your neck of the woods. Right. It was outside of Washington. It was still people come in after. It was this perfect mix in Delray Beach of the recovery community, which, is like a mecca down there. There's a treatment center on every corner, still is. And a lot of aging hippies and kind of artsy folks, and a lot of, retirees, a lot of New York Jews. Right. And they'd always mix in this coffee shop. Folks would come in after theater oh, it's like Greenwich Village in the 60s. And there'd be bikers and table of gay folks from the AA meeting over the gay AA meeting over there, and folks from the sober biker meeting over here, and the after theater crowd, all just interacting. And it was all just this crazy, wonderful scene. And through it, I met and fell in love with my ex. And it was really, I bet you got the connections to help me. It would make a great movie. It was 10 years of life just happened in this compressed, barely 2.5 year period. Yeah. Cut to the chase. The love of my life and I have this baby on the way. And I was having fun as the Pied Piper, and I was actually non-musician but music junkie. Was for about a year, was playing in 3 bands, 3 paying gigs.
Look at you!
I was playing bass in a blues band only because this blues band from West Side Liquor from across Swinton Avenue, as they subtly say, would come in for open mic, and the keyboard player was playing the bass lines on his Casio, and I had my what do you call it, pawn shop bass in the office. Let me sit in. That turned into a gig. Then other guys that were playing on open mic nights and features, pass the hat. I didn't even have to pay musicians, right? It was like LA in the 80s. And it was just perfect, right? So hooking up these guys and taking my moments to go sing this harmony with that one and that one, put a little group together. We actually opened for the reformed Jefferson Starship at the Stephen Talk House in South Beach. We had some pretty good gigs, Amnesty International Festival, stuff like that. And then I had this awesome, may she rest in peace, sadly, she's no longer with us, but one of the most wonderful humans ever, Tia, who was a hardcore biker from Hoboken, New Jersey. Unfortunately, she died out in L.A. She was one of the best drummers ever. But she wasn't a drummer. She fronted this band called the Chihuahuas, as lead singer. And there was just her, Jenny on drums, just a dynamite little drummer, and a guy named Lex on the bass who wrote all the songs, all the lyrics, all the music, and that was it. Played lead bass, and this hardcore chick on the vocals, and a drummer. And the running joke was she was working for me in the coffee house, and I was like this music Nazi. I had literal lists by the stereo. These genres of music are acceptable. These will not be played on my premises, right? And so the running joke was, hey, when are you going to let the Chihuahuas play in here? Like, hey, never, right? This, not my joint. But things started to go south with my partner, and I didn't know because he had more shares than I did that he could actually screw me out of it and turn into a whole ugly thing. And it was like, Tia, get your band in here Saturday night. And they were awesome. They were wonderful. I almost blew the windows out of the place. And in my exuberance, my excitement, jumped out from behind the bar with a soup ladle and an ice bucket and jumped up on stage with them. And another gig was born. I became the concussionist for the Chihuahuas. Oh, and they had go-go dancers with big boots. And it was unbelievable. We had some amazing gigs with them, too.
Yeah.
Right? So it was all this fantasy time. And then, well, baby time came around, and like by fate, this weird serendipity, we were literally not more than 2-3 months pregnant, hardly planned. And remember, I was working in drug treatment. My brother was working for Planned Parenthood. He had since moved on to the funding side of things. His director had moved on, but whoever his director's successor was called him in a panic. We desperately need somebody for your old job. Do you know anybody who can do that male responsibility, male sexuality educator who happens to be looking for a full-time gig with a baby on the way? So it's like this Planned Parenthood poster boy for a little while. And my kid grew up while I was I was a sexuality educator for 15 years. And during that time, I met first the brilliant, wonderful Marilyn Volker, a legend in Miami, one of the real early one of the San Francisco PhDs. Remember the Advanced Institute for the Study of Human Sexuality? They're still out there in San Francisco. They were one of the first PhD clinical sexology PhDs that maybe not in academia, but were widely recognized in the field of sexology. A lot of the big guns, in the Academy in Orlando, where I attended with the late Bill Granzik. So Marilyn Volker introduced me to Susan Lee. May she also rest in peace, sadly. They're no longer with us. But Susan studied with the late Helen Singer Kaplan in New York in the 80s, where sex therapy kind of, Masters and Johnson, I think, stumbled into it based on their work, which still blows my mind that, how long have we been studying human bodies and medicine and anatomy. And it was in my lifetime that anybody bothered to look at what happens to human bodies during sexual arousal.
Yeah.
It still blows my, every time I see Masters and Johnson 1966 and I go, holy shit, I was born in 1963. Nobody ever thought to look at this before then. Right?
Yeah.
But then in the 80s, Helen Kaplan said, you forgot one little piece there, like desire. So of course, that was huge. And Susan was one of that crew. They studied at, I think it was Cornell and Long Island Jewish Hospital. Michael Perlman, the giant in the field, was one of her supervisors, and a lot of noted figures, especially up in New York, came out of that crew. So I'd met Susan, and she was training sex therapists because, as you probably heard through Modern Institutes, there's still this weird thing. 25 years I'm trying to figure out the story, and I can't, of why Florida is the only state in the country that has this thing about using the term certified sex therapist.
Which, of all places, I would not put that on. I would not think that Florida would be the place to say, you know what, we're going to have this regulation,
and we're going to have this higher standard. We're going to have this academic, really Florida. Yeah, I thought the same thing. Just maybe some sex therapist was drinking with some legislator, and they here's a good idea. He probably wrote it up for him. But why the other 49 states never saw fit to follow suit, I don't know. But it was a mystery. But anyway, Susan moved to Florida from New York and started the one of the first institutes to train sex therapists to be sex therapists to meet the requirements for Florida. ASECT it sets the other standard, by default, right? Because there is it's not a government or license thing, but and they're a lot more stringent than Florida, which again, of course, I'm always for keeping the bar higher. So I met Susan, and I would teach her sex therapy students like one lecture out of her year-long training, like the family life, sex ed stuff. But then I started noticing working at Planned Parenthood and with Planned Parenthood folks all over the country that there's always this wall. There was the education departments that were always out in the community, begging and pleading for gigs anywhere they can get with doors slamming and church arguments and all the rest. And then the clinics. And the people working in the clinics were, medical RNs and PAs and mostly medical assistants and nurse assistants, CNAs, whatever. There was a really cool thing, which we were all surprised it passed. A major grant called Teen Time, where one day a week we had a clinic. It was a partnership between Planned Parenthood, the school board, the health department, Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies, and all the antis were going crazy about it, and it passed anyway. So we had one day a week where teens could come in. It's a weird thing about legal, I guess, like emancipation of sorts, right? Like you can't put a Band-Aid on a paper cut on a minor without parental consent. You can't spray a mosquito bite, right? That's medical treatment without parental consent. But if a kid walks in, a 13-year-old walks in and says, it burns when I pee, I think I have an STD. As soon as the word leaves her mouth, she's legally emancipated, specific to her sexual and reproductive health. She does not need parental consent. And, remember we had Jeb, who I used to call the president's smarter brother, till I realized what a schmuck he is too. When he was our governor, and there was all that mess about so parental consent might be a little heavy-handed, so we're going to try parental notification laws. Like if a kid's in my office saying, I think I'm pregnant, and if my dad finds out, he's going to beat me up and throw me out of the house. My job is to say, well, you sit right here, I'll go call him. And I don't have to tell him, but I have to tell him you're here. Like, I wanted to be arrested, right? I used to, please bust me in those days. Now I'm not so quick. Yes. Yeah, I wanted to get busted for giving out condoms at Lollapalooza because Trojan didn't show up. So I had 10,000 of my own from the health department. But anyway, I just saw this missing thing, that there's this real huge opportunity all over the country, Planned Parenthood clinics for sexual counseling that was not being done. And so that's what prompted me to go back to school after my dismal first attempt at pharmacy school to get a master's in mental health counseling. And I was a department of one because, 3 times they asked me to be the education director, and I was like, no, I don't want to be an administrator. I kept training my bosses in succession of bosses. So I became the vice president of education, training, and counseling services. Like fold-out business cards. But I created this counseling services protocol for the clinics, and that's what got me into. So then, of course, as you know, got the master's, had to sit and get supervised counseling for 2 years before I could sit for my license. So Susan convinced me to go through her Sex Therapy Training Institute during that 2 years. So as soon as I passed my license exam, I was instantly a certified sex therapist. And then it was just a classic mentor apprentice. I knew that didn't have the most romantic story towards leading to my PhD. I'm much more proud to be part of Modern Institutes and what we're trying to do over here than a little bit more of a, I'll just politely, diplomatically say, more traditional, stale program. But it was in large part prompted by knowing that as I became more and more a partner of Susan's, that the time would come. I didn't expect it to come as soon as it did, but that I would be running her institute, so I should probably have a PhD. Wasn't anything more glamorous than that. But sadly, she got cancer in 2015. And we had a Florida institute, and we also started a second one in New York in 2011. We used we used to rent the faculty house at Columbia and hold classes there. It was really nice, very Tony. So I had to finish those and was in a scramble. And again, just as serendipitously, Rachel had approached me. Rachel and I went way back, but from weird circumstances, right? Because both my brother and I, with the Planned Parenthood history, knew Rachel's mom, Mona.
Yeah.
Brilliant, wonderful woman. Because we were like foxhole buddies, you know, because she owned Presidential Women's Center, and we worked at Planned Parenthood. And we knew Rachel kind of coming up. And then, you know, she went to grad school, of course, became a psychologist, got these like amazing postdocs with giants in the field, like Stan Althoff and the late, great, why is her name escaping me? The woman who coined PGAD. And, she was died too young in a freak biking accident. But she was also one of those in that same New York crew, the medical, psychological. So Rachel approached me to kind of tie our ships together, and we created this. And it's really, I have to give the far lion's share of the credit to her business acumen. I love training therapists. I'm passionate about it. It's one of my pet peeves. So, you know, thankfully, again, like a dream come true, I'm able to do that and not have to worry about so many business things that I know nothing about. That she's a genius with.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I want to take a short break right here. I know I like to do these as little mental health kind of check-ins, pleasure check-ins, and today I'm really looking forward to sharing this with y'all because this is a fantastic resource. So much of the work I do with clients revolves around self-compassion, and it sounds super woo-woo-y, and I know sometimes it feels like, well, what even is that? How do we actually hold space for that? How do we actually practice that? And often I encourage folks to journal. And oftentimes folks feel a sense of loss when it comes to journaling, some confusion, right? Of where did they begin? How do they do this? Sometimes it feels scary to start journaling because there isn't guidance and it feels like you're going to start spiraling. And I'm so thrilled to share this with y'all. There's this journal. It's a guided journal, walks you through 91 days of like a self-love journal. And it is honestly fantastic. They partnered with psychologists, clinical therapists, researchers, psychiatrists, and other mental health specialists who have years of experiences and are like really actually helping people walk through their self-love journey. And the company's called Switch. And so the journal that they have, it's in 3 different sections. It walks you through like reframing things, self-kindness, common humanity, mindfulness, which are like the 3 main components of self-compassion, and actually provides you like structured exercises and things to do. Also, not to mention, it's like a very, very cute journal. Okay. There's plants all in it. It's a very well done product and super, super helpful. So highly, highly recommend it. If you feel like journaling is kind of a scary place to go, if you want to like kind of have a little bit more accountability with your check-ins with yourself, maybe maybe you feel like a friend could really benefit from it. Maybe if there's a friend going through a really, really rough time right now where they could, practice some self-compassion, where maybe they're being really hard on themselves. I'm sure you're a little hard on yourself sometimes. We all are. So I honestly think anybody could benefit from this journal by Switch and actually have some support in transforming your negative self-critical thoughts into self-love through self-compassion. So you can use our code TALK20 today at switchresearch.org, and you can get 20% off your purchase. Again, that's TALK20 at switchresearch.org and get 20% off your purchase. So I hope you enjoy that and take advantage of this resource while we got it for y'all, okay? And now we can get back to the show. Well, I think, Ricky, it's definitely I love hearing some of this background into how you got to where you are, because I see so much more of your personality, which I just love. And I definitely thought that you were just a much more quiet kind of guy. But then there's been a few times where you've said stuff when we're talking about marijuana and sex or these other things that come up in class where I'm like, oh, Ricky's on it. He is on it. And I would love to, yes, I would love to get into a little bit, you talk about sex publicly, this is part of your specialty. And your brother kind of it sounds like maybe helped inspire you in some ways to be getting into this part of the field.
For sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and you have a daughter as well. And so I'm wondering how you go about those conversations, being in the position that you are in within this field of sexuality, how that shows up within your family.
Yeah. Interesting. It's I can't believe I'm going to talk about this. But doing everything I did for a living and being, especially in the Planned Parenthood days, right? I mean, I was working with drug treatment, and then for Planned Parenthood of all organizations, and always been kind of a lefty, progressive, waving my tie-dyed freak flag. I used to have a ponytail down to my ass. So
I can picture it, Ricky. I see it.
Oh, definitely. And doing Girl Scout troop sex ed groups. Can you imagine me walking in and oh my God, I always won them over. But it was a weird family dynamic, right? And even as hip and liberal as I, pretended, tried real hard, always thought I was. Now I'm getting old. But it was still I'm having a daughter and had all of those same kind of conservative, I have a daughter. I remember one of my graduate school professors, she said, she told the story of how she told her 3 daughters as they grew up that sex is a wonderful thing that people do when they get their PhDs. Right? And my thoughts, if I had a son, I'd be waiting up for him and come home and high five him when he tells me he got laid the first time. My boy. But no, I have a daughter. I have to lock her in her room until she's 30. Mm-hmm. So I really did go through a lot of that. I went through a lot of thinking about dads of girlfriends in college that never dawned on me. They come visit the school and I'm laying there in a robe, hey, how you doing, Pops? And never occurred to me he could be sitting there thinking, I'm going to choke the life out of you. You're filing my daughter. And I did kind of go through that. And fortunately, it's a small field and a small community, even sexuality educators and sex therapists. And so there's always been these kind of conversations, but the stories always seem to run the same, right? The families are either kids are either Deborah Hafner and I once talked about this. Somebody should write a book about the kids of sexologists, right? Mm-hmm. Either those kids that are just the kid in kindergarten cop, right? Boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. And all the kids giggle and the adults are mortified, right? Or they're those, oh, mother, please. There she goes again, right? The ones that want nothing to do with it. But more often,
have you seen the show Sex Education on Netflix?
Yeah. A little bit of that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. More often than not, that's the house where all the kids go, and the kids' friends know that they can. Right? But gratefully for that little conservative Archie Bunker that lives somewhere in there, my kid, grew up really liberal parents and liberal kid. Politically, it was none of that like Michael J. Fox rebellion thing. But personally, I don't know if she's not embarrassed I'm talking about her in this way, but she was a little more conservative, I guess, because she grew up seeing, and, much as sometimes people think, sex therapy is sexy work, but let's be honest, sex ed is anything but. And I was, people say, oh, you're a sexuality educator. Like, what part of that do you think is sexy? STDs, teen pregnancy, violent, abusive, like sex ed is anti-sexy, right? But she grew up around this just sexual health and books around, and always, we didn't really have a lot of like sit-down conversations, but there was just always such a comfort, right? She was diagnosed the type 1 diabetic at 18 months. So, a lot of hands-on stuff had to happen. And I was single dad for a number of years. So if, like most diabetic girls are prone to yeast infections, so you got to deal with. And it was just a kind of matter of factness. But the bigger family was funny too. Even my parents were classic opposites attract. Dad was a wise-ass Navy guy from Brooklyn, and Mom was a goody two-shoes priss from the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. And they couldn't, fairy tale, met on the beach in Far Rockaway, but couldn't have been more opposite. And Mom, too, wicked liberal. Mom was like almost arrested at an anti-protest. This was 1965. I was 2 years old in Sacramento. A gynecologist was being protested by anti-choice folks, right-to-lifers. And my mom was part of a defense line anti-protests with all three of her kids. I guess my oldest brother was 5. I was a little baby. And like, again, daring the cops, see where I get it, right? Daring the cops, bust a lady with 3 babies, I dare you. Right, so she was always very activist and liberal, but really conservative from her upbringing. She was a generation escaping the Holocaust with my grandparents. They left from Vienna. Actually, wasn't even we were first generation born on Mom's side. She was born in Vienna. So she's the only woman in a family of 5. She raised 3 boys that. It was like, oh, my button fell off. She's like, oh, you want to wear that shirt? Like, yeah. I said, well, you better learn to sew because I got shit to do. So she raised boys that sewed and changed poopy diapers and, all that stuff. But there was a divide, right? Because when she retired, and we did it backwards, Mom and Dad followed Larry and I to Florida. And so usually the kids follow the parents down, But they had their first grandchild. Of course, they had to be close by. But Mom, when she retired from being a physical therapist, volunteered at our Planned Parenthood clinic. This old Jewish mother was doing birth control options counseling and HIV testing and classic moment sitting in a huge auditorium. She's in the back with getting her HIV 104 testing training and talking about all the routes of transmission and, unprotected anal sex with internal ejaculation. And we hear from the back of the room, that's how you talk in front of your mother? Had a lot of moments like that. But then Dad and our older brother, they would literally like, there they go. They would get up and leave the room. Mom would get excited about, we got these new latex Japanese condoms at the clinic today. And they'd be, there she goes. And leave. So it was... Yeah, it's been interesting.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like I think first it's important to just note that, like, while, yes, you can grow up pretty liberal, right, and having more, like, progressive type views, that there is still stuff to unpack, and it sounds like you really recognized that coming up when you had your daughter of like, I need to check myself and unpack some of these ways that I might continuously perpetuate patriarchy onto her or these double standards onto her. So I think that's always important to kind of just hold space for.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think we share that in common in some ways, right? Be able to grow. I mean, that was the thing. I remember the craziness when John Kerry was running against George W. Bush, and they called him flip-flopper because he changed his position. You mean grew, evolved, learned, right? Oh, no, you just...
Yeah. I think, honestly, that's a part that a lot of people think that because they hold these liberal views that they don't have these things to unpack. And when it comes up, that moment, it feels like there's a lot of shame there when really it's just like, well, yeah, like, because this is the ideology that's reinforced everywhere. So of course, that's going to come up.
And that's why it's so critical to our training. I don't mean to like jump ship, but
jump it.
It's such a problem in health professions when people, I mean, I used to work by this wonderful, I don't know what to call it, phrase, koan. I was first heard from another Planned Parenthood director, but it came from an Oglala Sioux priest named Father Reuben that says, wrap cotton around your feet before you step into the life of another. And I think that, really underscores the audacity, the balls that it is to do this kind of work and to do this work without unpacking our own is pretty ballsy, I think. It's, and there's potential to make you really not good at it.
Yeah. Well, and you do a lot of supervising as well. So I'm wondering, like, what kinds of things you notice through doing the work of supervision that, like, is a really common thread or something that, like, really frustrates you or, like, gets you going, that when you're working with your supervisees, you're like, oh, this is still a thing.
Not much, I'm happy to say, right? Because, it's a biased group of people who want to be sex therapists, but I mean, I've seen extremely strong reactions to porn. That's common, like I see in Facebook groups for therapists. Anybody just mentions porn, and immediately there's a flurry of it has to be porn addiction kinds of responses. Again, I'll refrain from going off on that rant. But people can go, as you know, people can go through graduate school and pass a test and get a license and be in practice, even something like the SAR training, the sexual attitude reassessment. My brother and I once years ago were at a conference. It amounted to an intervention. This woman was having a meltdown over, I can't believe they're forcing me to watch porn. They tell me I have
Lord.
porn. And we're looking at each other like, she wants to be a sex therapist? And especially in those, those were kind of vanilla SAR trainings. It was nothing shocking. But imagine somebody who's a licensed therapist who wants to be a sex therapist, like being apoplectic over something like, and you could close your eyes. We're not going to strap you in a Alex chair like Clockwork Orange and pry your eyeballs open. So there's a lot. It's really runs through the field. It's just God, one of my favorite rants is I doubt if I'll have a gravestone, but I don't plan on going out that way. But wherever it ends up being etched, I wouldn't mind being known for it, right? Because I've just been so frustrated for so many years. And especially, I can't help, I know we're all in the same business, but marriage and family therapists, it's in their name. Like, why do you get married and how do they have families? And how do you do that for a living and not talk about sex? How do you actively avoid talking about sex? Right? So my go-to marketing line, right, what I call my Jewish mother guilt trip marketing line, is to compare it to plumbers that don't do toilets, because nobody in their right mind would tolerate that, right? Especially if your toilet's backed up and you stand in your bathroom and there's a plumber standing there saying, no, I'm sorry, I only do sinks and showers. You're like, what do you mean? You don't do toilets? Oh, I went to a conservative plumbing school. We didn't talk about toilets. no, then get out of my house and get out of plumbing. Right?
Went to conservative plumbing school. That's great.
I don't want to slag, but like there are Christian sex therapists. There's an organization of Christian sex therapists, and I can't help wonder how they deal with orientation and gender and sexually marginalized people. And don't do it because God doesn't want us to. I can't wrap my head around that. But
what I don't understand is how can they say that like God doesn't want us to? Like, how do you know what God does and doesn't want for us? And also, like, I don't know. I'm not religious, and it's like we've talked about this in some episodes. But you know, where is He saying you should not have sex?
Well,
like you need to have sex.
Sex in certain ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
yes. And not too much. You know, you can enjoy it, but not too much.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, there used to be this old, like, before, like, the 30-year run to try and get hypersexuality clinically defined in the DSM, which has failed now. 3 editions of DSM. But
yeah,
to be this old joke, the definition of promiscuous is anybody who has sex more often than I do, whoever happens to be saying that, right?
Yep.
So,
yeah.
It's so judgy.
Yeah. I feel like this topic of sex addiction and like hypersexuality comes up so frequently. And I know I touched on this in my episode with Joe because he, you know, has this whole history with that. Right. But I mean, I'm wondering if you can touch on kind of your perspective on sex addiction for a minute.
Well, it's strong. It's, I piss off Rachel sometimes. It's a little too strong. Just because first, when it's presented as a treatment model, I've never seen anything more perfectly suited to destroy the lover's dynamic in a couple, right? Because to me, it's very similar to, and this is another, I think, way too common failure among therapists, even marriage counselors, I have to say, with affairs.
Yes.
As soon as those labels cheater and cheated on get hung, couples counseling is like done. Now you can, and I've actually heard of this literally, I say it like figuratively, but I've heard of this literally, where a therapist will pull a chair next to theirs for the poor cheated on, and they're sitting across from the cheater, and that's not couples therapy. It's like, what does the cheater have to do to show enough guilt, enough remorse, enough, begging and pleading, and even the big guns, even like the Gottmans, all of this, their attunement, it amounts to an inquisition that kills. And my worst complaint is whatever crisis brought them in, whatever they're calling it, it's almost always self or partner diagnosed, right? And the therapist just runs with it. That becomes the new permanent. Instead of a crisis that we as therapists can help a couple through, that's the new forever. You're the addict and you're the partner of the addict. That's your new identity for the rest of your lives. And that's not sexy. That turns the partner into a parent, right? The addict is the adolescent that can never be trusted. I remember I supervised a woman that had this couple. My first question is, why does this guy come home from work? Every single day he'd come home from work. The wife would be standing inside the door waiting for him. Not a hello, hi, dear, kiss on the cheek, how was work? He would walk in the door and her first words were, did you masturbate at work today? Let me see your phone. Right? Like every time I recall that, I just picture the 50s, angry housewife with the apron and the rolling pin, and the disgust. And he's just this humiliated, beaten down. How could they be lovers again? Unless one of us gets a hold of them and just knocks them out of that dynamic and back into a lover's one.
I had never heard of a therapist pulling the chair over and doing that. I mean, my face, I could never imagine.
Yeah.
That is so harmful.
Yeah.
That's fucked up.
It is. Yeah. And it doesn't heal. It doesn't help heal Couples.
No.
I'm a big fan of Esther Perel, of course, and her book on affairs. People just, another of the big guns. I shouldn't be slagging people in a public forum, but it was in the New York Times, so I'm just quoting the paper, right? It was this big conference years ago that a whole bunch, it wasn't no debate. It wasn't one side against another. It was just a whole bunch of therapists. Some were sex therapists like Marty Klein, Esther Perel, who's an honorary sex therapist, marriage and family therapist, and Sue Johnson, and some of those big guns. And Sue Johnson was actually quoted in the New York Times as saying, "The idea that an affair could be good for a relationship is the craziest thing I ever heard." I thought
it could be.
My first thought was that you're this renowned therapist, and that's the craziest thing you ever heard. And then, yes, of course, it can be. It could be great. It could be like just what the relationship needs to go, holy shit, how did we end up here? Right?
Now, I can understand that and you can understand that, but can you unpack that a little bit for listeners who might be like, what the fuck? No, if somebody cheats, that is the absolute death of the relationship.
Yeah. Again, I quote Esther and her brilliance when she talks about the typical European versus the typical American reaction to an affair. Right? Whereas the first one is like, well, what does this mean for us? We done? Yeah. You want to be with that one? You want to be with, right? It's adult, honestly, and it's workable in therapy. The typical American reaction is, how could you do this to me? And that whole morality play and the big betrayal. And of course, the new language in the addiction circles is betrayal, trauma, and everything. They've just wrapped everything in trauma in this ongoing effort to get clinical legitimacy when the word itself, addiction, will never have clinical relevance. It's a user-defined concept, right? I'm sorry, another tear, but you can't advertise chocolates as addictively delicious and then put people in inpatient treatment for, jerking off too much and use the same language. It's no. But I digress again. I'm sorry.
You crack me up. You really crack me up. Well, and I think both of those things, the purpose to me, the consequence of it is really just demonizing and stigmatizing sex, period, which I think ultimately comes from purity culture, comes from our overarching systems of white supremacy, which is including purity culture in that I think is the purity culture piece is less in Europe, to where they can have those conversations and it not be this huge thing. But even just our relationship with monogamy in the States and how cheating is this huge thing. Obviously, yes, that person is hurt. That person can absolutely feel a sense of betrayal, right? And that is hard for them. But also, in that same hand, I think probably where therapists kind of go wrong is not holding space for the and piece, because it is, yes, you are hurt, and there was also something happening in the relationship to begin with that made this person do this. And yes, we probably need to hold some space for the fact that this is a lot to take in.
Sure, but
maybe for both people, I don't know.
Another of my favorite ands is your partner loves you and they did this.
Yes.
It doesn't mean because they did this, they don't love you. There's a lot that can really, a lot of good work can be done if they're a little better at it.
It's hard. We just, even in what we're talking about now, we're holding space for really difficult things that, we talked about at the beginning, if you haven't checked your own bias and your own experiences and your own feelings about things, then that's going to come up and you're not going to be able to hold that space and help people navigate through these really tough things in a way that is actually healing and beneficial for them long term.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's a balancing act sometimes to try not to overassume because of our biases, right? So to maintain that kind of clinical neutrality, not be so quick to judge, although it is part of our job, right? I think that's
do you think that there even is a such thing as clinical neutrality?
I think there's such a thing as a constant intentional effort towards trying.
Yeah.
We're all, we're also blinded by our own privileges and biases and all the rest of that baggage. And I'm glad that's really become part of the conversation. Sometimes it seems to overtake sexuality as part of the conversation, but it's important. Pendula needs to have time to swing. They've been stuck too far one way too long. I'm okay with that. Gets a little weird. I got to say, there's something about, this implicit, once or twice explicit message that, I could take my white male cisgendered heterosexual privilege and shut the fuck up when hey, when did I've been fighting this fight a long time, right? When did I become the enemy? That's been something I've been getting to for a long time.
Yeah,
but it's a really important time for sex therapy. It just really is. And if I could, I feel like a ADD on display, but if I could just shift the channel again, you mentioned before, sexual medicine. It's just it's so critical, and we're still missing it, right? Because I think it's fair to say that, not that it was born, it's been around a long time, but sexual medicine was definitely reborn in 1998 with Viagra, right? Before then, physicians really didn't give a crap, and after then, they're like, oh, great, sex therapist. But I think still since 1998, we have not we haven't integrated. That's another drum my brother and I like to bang. I think of the fantasies I will talk about in public, one of them is that someday there'll be a sex therapist in every gynecologist's office, every urologist's office, endocrinologists while we're at it, cardiologists, just across the board. Fertility. What's something more sexless than fertility treatment? Obstetrics. That's, to me, that's the one that blows my mind more than anything else. The only area of medicine where it's disease, it's not disease that makes you a patient, right? It's obstetrics. Everything else, if you're a cardiac patient because you have cardiac disease. If you're an oncology patient, it's because you have cancer. If you're an obstetrics patient, it's because you're pregnant. And how did you get that way? And how do you go through 9 months of pregnancy care and labor and delivery and post-care and avoid that whole subject?
Yeah.
Makes my head explode. Yeah.
Well, especially for fertility treatment. And I don't know, I mean, I guess I've never been through the process, so it's probably why I haven't thought of it and it hasn't come up for me. But when you are trying to get pregnant and you are working with a physician, it would make a whole lot of fucking sense to have a referral to also be working with a sex therapist.
I've seen it many times. It's a tragedy that these couples are spending years and tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. You'd think, and multiple failures, right, and all the heartbreak that goes with it, you'd think when they succeed, and those weird, drugs they use, they make your ovaries like Jiffy Pop, so sometimes they're like triplets, and you'd think they'd be the happiest people in the world, right? And a lot of times they're in a divorce court within a year because the relationship could not stand the strain of that much. The only time I ever hear guys complain about being treated like a sex object, the only time.
There's a lot of stress on the actual just act of sex between the two people that are trying to have a baby that it's like, but
sometimes one is trying harder than the other.
Yeah.
And the other hears, get in here, I'm ovulating. It's like, oh, great. There's the sexy come on. And, he feels like I'm just a sperm donor now. And and then pushed out. There's a lot that needs sex therapy. There's so many areas where sex therapy is needed. So, like we were talking about before we started rolling. It's become this rant because I know everybody can't specialize in everything, and we need specialists, right? I couldn't be more grateful for the trauma specialists that I have the pleasure of working with, because I got none of that in my training, right? But sex has to be a specialty, right? For people who work with couples, and even for individuals, for therapists who are invited into the deepest, most personal, private parts of their lives. And I think this is a sad truth. Most therapists would be a lot more comfortable talking about someone's most horrific, painful sexual abuse than their most ecstatic, wonderful sexual experience. And
yeah, well, because things are so sexualized, but we don't actually allow for things to be sexy.
Yeah.
And so it's like, with infertility, even working through like sexual trauma, like where is the space for folks to have encouragement and be held through finding and engaging in what's sexy? That desire, that arousal, like it's everywhere else, right? Like movies and online and advertisements to be sexualized.
Right.
But we don't let things actually be sexy, and like that excitement of like, oh, like I'm feeling really horny. Like I'm feeling sexy is like just automatically this negative thing that makes other people feel uncomfortable, because then it's like, oh, think bad things are going to happen. And like, that's not, you don't look good at being in that way, but it's like, well, but it's fucking everywhere. So like, what are you talking about?
Right. Yeah. And that thing you were talking about before, the overarching themes that we all kind of grew up under, dampen sexy too.
Yeah.
The best couple I ever had, I remember thinking every sex therapist should get one of these. This is like a gift from the sex therapy gods. Hot young couple, really into each other, really sexy, got pregnant, had a little panic, and came to me and said, I will quote them forever. They said, please, you got to help us not turn into our parents. I said, that I can do, right? And they were the best. They're just, I mean, they continued coming to sex therapy through the pregnancy. After, they would literally sit in my office with baby on the breast and plan their sexy dates. Why doesn't everybody do this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of makes me think back to what sometimes is a Band-Aid, things like Viagra, where, you know, there are things that you can do that sometimes avoid you doing that work, because that work is hard and that work is uncomfortable sometimes, that work is scary. But, you know, I'm wondering for you where you really see the place for things like sexual medicine that can be used in a way that is actually helpful and is not just putting a Band-Aid perhaps on things.
Yeah, well, definitely. We as sex therapists, I think this is, how do you say no to this? We can tell medical providers that we can improve the compliance and the success of their treatment, right? Because you tell a guy to take a pill, and, you know, he goes home and takes a pill, and he starts watching his watch and watching his crotch and watching his watch and thinking like Jack and Beanstalk.
Watching his watch and watching his crotch. I can't with you, Ricky. That's great.
Waiting for this thing to grow, right? Instead of half an hour, 20 minutes with a sex therapist. Look, take the pill, forget about it. Go wash the car or something, right? And then just do everything you did without the pill. Sexy thoughts, friction and fantasy. Right, the pill's not an aphrodisiac. It's not going to make you horny. It's just a plumbing thing, right? Teach him how to use the pill. And I don't like these apps now. You know, it's like get hard or your money back. I have stats from urologists and folks like Michael Perlman. The numbers. I have a number of urologists that tell me half the Viagra scripts they write don't get refilled. It's really not this miracle boner in a pill that people think it is. Yeah. Or some guys take it like a club drug, you know. It's like, no, it doesn't just grow boners out of nowhere. So, yeah, it's great if a guy, you know, there's not a lot that talk therapy is going to do for a guy who's, you know, like my age, like 58 and pre-diabetic and hypertensive and overweight. That's a metabolic thing. He's going to have ED. he's going to need Viagra. But coupled with sex therapy, so he doesn't feel like a failure, so his partner doesn't feel insulted that, I used to just, show you a boob and you chase me around. Now you need a pill. Forget it. Go have sex with your pill, right? All of those great sex therapy issues that physicians aren't having those conversations.
Yeah.
So just imagine the doc saying, here's a script for Viagra, and I got a sex therapist I want you to talk to before you go to the pharmacy. Oh, what a world. That would be awesome. Yeah.
What? That's a no-brainer.
Right. Even think of things like GI. These people who go through bariatrics and these huge, right? You don't think there's body image and sexuality issues that should be talked about? And addressing like the unrealistic expectations, like you're going to wake up from anesthesia looking like a Sports Illustrated model. There's a lot of therapy and it really should be a sex therapist. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things that happen in our society that just don't make sense.
It all comes back to our discomfort with sex, right? What is the most universal? What else can we say every human being on the planet has in common? And that's the thing we can't talk about? How crazy is that? It's weird. But I'm glad, people like us are doing this work.
Yeah. I mean,
we're not worried about job security. That's good and bad, right? We're not going to work ourselves out of a job anytime soon.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I feel like you've mentioned a few things already, but I guess a place I want to kind of like leave us off on here is like, what do you hope, maybe if one thing more than anything, do you hope to see change in the field of sex therapy, let's say in the next 10 years?
Much better integration with sexual medicine, which is happening slowly, but I hope it continues. Definitely much, much more, again, happening, but continued. I know it sounds corny to talk about these days, but we have to, and we should have been talking about it all along. The DEI stuff. It's been a very, ASECT has stepped up. We were at a conference years ago, and the brilliant, wonderful Judith Steinhardt from New York City stood up and just called everybody out. It was a plenary session. Everybody was in the room together, and she just said, I want everybody to stand up and look around this room and tell me if you see the same thing I see. And it's
all white people.
A sea of white people. And in the past 20 years, it has changed wonderfully. But some of the other professional organizations, like STAR is awesome, it's wonderful. It's like, it's like every conference is like going back to grad school. But truth is, it's like either high holiday services or Canadians. It's a bunch of New York Jews and folks from Montreal and very, very
homogenous.
Right? Everybody has sex. I'm not glad, but to that point, a lot of what gets the most attention in terms of sex problems, like sex addiction, are pretty white problems, right? There's a lot of sex addicts in communities of color because, really, it's having,
What else are white people sex problems, Ricky?
Wow, we'd have to do another hour on that. That one I'd have to prep for.
I'm gonna have to talk to you about my potential doctoral project, what I'm thinking for this. So we'll have to dive into that more. But thank you so much for sharing everything.
Talking with you. Thank you for having me.
Yes. If people do want to follow your work at all or get more like involved in the things that you're doing, any places that they can kind of follow you or get in contact with you if interested?
Well, I don't have a big footprint, but modern sex therapy institutes.com. My brother and I have a little YouTube, what was formerly a radio show until we shook off the FCC censor, Sex Talk with the Siegel brothers on YouTube.
Amazing.
You can join us over there one of these days.
I would love to. Thank you so much, Ricky.
Thank you, Taylor. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for making it all the way through and keeping your ears, your hearts, and your minds open. It would mean so much to me if you could take a second or two after listening to this episode to leave a review on iTunes and let me know what you're enjoying about the show. I love reading, what your favorite episodes are, where you guys listen, and definitely feel free to share this with a friend. I mean, part of how we break down the stigmas around these topics is by talking about them, right? And sharing them with more people. So definitely share the podcast. And again, really wanting to include all of you in this podcast. So if you have questions or you want to share a thought or an experience, please send in a voice memo to ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. And I'm really excited to keep having these conversations and breaking down these stigmas. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next time.